Hello everybody, this is Dr. Kevin Novak again. Someone asked me to talk a little bit on CO2 and the importance of CO2 in a planted tank like this. This planted tank here is 5 months old now, and of course you wouldn't have the growth you're looking at in 5 months without CO2. It doesn't matter how much fertilizer you would put into your aquarium if you don't have adequate light, if you don't have adequate CO2. Now CO2 doesn't have to be 30 parts per million. When I mean adequate, it can even be 10 parts per million. As long as it's more than what the tank has, which is considerably very low, not enough to really grow plants and have them photosynthesize to their fullest. And that's the whole part, is making sure your plants photosynthesize to their fullest, because that is what actually does all the work for you, is when they're photosynthesizing. In this particular tank, because of the high light output I have, which is very high, it will literally beat a $450 Kessel light, the lighting on this tank, and it's extremely cheap to make. But without the CO2, we would probably be looking at a lot of hair algae growing all over the plants, especially the Java fern there would have hair algae growing all over the top of it, and that is something that you don't want. So even though Java fern is a slow-growing plant, with CO2 and the right kind of lighting, it can grow pretty quick, I would say. No, not as fast as like Wisteria or Ludwig, but it does grow pretty quick, as you can see. If you look at my earlier videos, how fast some of these plants have grown in just 5 months, yeah, the CO2 is highly recommended. Otherwise, your plants are going to grow just too slow. You're not going to be satisfied with what you got. And then the probability of you fighting algae is more than likely. But there is one thing. CO2 is not going to do you any good if you keep using plant tabs. Plant tabs have nitrogen. Anything that has nitrogen is bad. Nitrogen is not wanted. Make sure it's ammonia. So use a substrate like I'm using that has iron and magnesium in it and all your microelements that plants need. And you shouldn't have any problems then with algae. Like, yeah, you don't see any algae in this tank. That's because the plants are really cleaning the tank itself. And it's working very well. But there is one thing I've always said about planted tanks. They are filthy, and you really need some form of, pre-filter to get everything out of that tank, to clean it up. And that's another problem hobbyists have. They get like canister filters or something, of that sort, which is great. But you need to do maintenance on it. At least once a week, clean out something, because it just gets so incredibly dirty, planted tanks, because you can't clean them. You can't use a gravel vac on them or anything like that. You can do a water change, but that's going to be useless because all your detritus and smut and detritus is going to be caught up in the substrate. So planted tanks are horrendously dirty, even though I only have 6 angels in this tank and some dither fish, the zebras. This tank accumulates quite a lot of dirt, and you need to get that out of there. Otherwise, you're going to have another problem with algae and cyanobacteria. And you're never going to get rid of cyanobacteria 100%. Cyanobacteria is 5 billion years old. It's one of the oldest bacteria on the planet Earth. You'll never get rid of it. In my tank, once again, I'll show you, I use one of the socks This sock is already this dirty after only 5 days. So what does that tell you? 6 angelfish making this much of a mess? No. This is basically because planted tanks are very dirty, and you need to get that dirt, that detritus out of there. And well, there's a fish in my pre-filter, which happens. I did explain in a video how I make the hole in it and not use a gate valve, and this is the reason why. If a fish does happen to get back in the weir and get sucked in, it doesn't get crushed to death. It's able to go through the hole, and after this video I'll net him out and he'll be just fine. Go back in the main tank. But injecting CO2 was quite easy. I put it in the last part of the sump. I use a small little pump. The CO2 goes in an air line to the pump. The pump impeller chops it up. So there's nothing elaborate here, just a cheap pump. It blows it right in towards the main inlet pump to the aquarium. And that's about it. Now my CO2 levels aren't really very high at all. They're maybe 15 parts per million, which is quite low. That's about half of what people recommend. But you don't need 30 parts per million. Even at 15 or 10 will be more than enough, because it will be far better than what you have, which is almost nothing. And you're constantly gassing off CO2 in your aquarium. And because that's one of the 5 main elements, CO2, sunlight, manganese, iron, and of course ammonia. Those are your 5. If you're lacking any one of those 5, you fall under the Liebig minimum law for plant growth. And the rest of the micro elements, not quite as important. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, maybe I'll talk more about nitrates that people keep putting in their aquarium, as far as root tabs. Very bad. Stay away from them. Thank you very much.